Bonjour, habari za leo. My name is Kevin Mutia.
Solofina Nekesa.
Lauren Arnza.
Ryan Fisher, Professional Officer at Etiquette Africa. On behalf of Etiquette Africa, the African Center for Cities, our future cities, and partners, I'm excited to welcome all of you to the Rise Africa 2021 Action Festival.
Rise Africa has been growing as a platform of thinkers, doers, enablers, committed to inspiring action for sustainable cities.
Rise Africa is about building active networks across academia, government, private sector, civil society, and the arts.
Our entry point is based not on articulating problems followed by proposing solutions, but rather on celebrating our cities as places of innovation and culture, while asking what more we can do to make them sustainable, inclusive, and vibrant.
This festival is hosting 46 sessions over 5 days from across 16 countries in Africa and the world. Every session aims to share new ideas, showcase ongoing actions, and launch new initiatives by bringing participants together to chart a new route forward.
We hope that the festival program will inspire you to commit to one or more specific actions that you or your organizations will take on. As this session closes, you will be redirected to a survey in which you can articulate these actions. We will follow up on these committed actions throughout the year and offer resources, connections, and support. In this way, we are testing the idea that events can galvanize action, and we hope that you will join us in this effort.
Beyond this session, there are many ways to take part in the festival.
Register for further sessions.
Vote for your favorites in the photo competition.
Test your knowledge of African cities from our daily quiz.
Watch a variety of inspiring video provocations.
And listen and dance to the Rise Africa 2021 playlist.
We hope that you will make all attempts to reach out to new people and build lasting connections.
Before we begin, it's important to note that this session is being recorded and that by participating, you are consenting to be recorded. All recordings will be available on the program page after the festival.
Creative expression is vital for creating new futures for our cities. So we invite you to enter this session in the spirit of creativity and dreaming.
When inspired fires fly. We are moving into the city again this morning. Our dreams tucked under our arms and the bags under our eyes overflowing with hope. We are moving this city again out of mourning, cleaning our streams of consciousness with floodlight ideas to illuminate the workings of our inner scope. We've masked our intentions anew. We've strengthened our bones, calcified our resilience, and merged stillness with our minds using breath as the sinew. We continue to forge a dreamscape across an arid land held hostage by reality. We are watering smiles into the cracks in the concrete. Reinventing laughter to sprout and fill the lulls in our conversations. Yes, our windows open towards brick walls, but our eyes are the source of sunlight. We are living temples of light, moving across the cityscapes, mobile street lamps, the reflection of the heavens we rose from.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope that you have begun to be inspired by that very creative video that came through from Ecli. But I would like to welcome you all and thank you so much for joining us in our session, which is entitled Co-Developing Climate Information to Support Climate Resilience and Adaptation Planning Decisions in Southern African Cities. And we are very excited that you could make it, considering the time, considering Zoom fatigue, and all those other things. My name is Mzime Morisa, and today I will be the moderator for this session. I am a program specialist at START International, and together with the program whose acronym is FRACTAL. START is co-hosting this session. So this is a dialogue and performance session, and the main objective really is to highlight learnings from this program called FRACTAL, which is the Future Resilience for African Cities. And this was implemented across 9 Southern African countries. And today the focus is really going to be on the learning labs, which we will hear about much more as we go. And since this is a dialogue and performance session, we'll start off with the dialogue. And this is going to be featuring sound bites from the actual learning labs that were implemented on the ground and in the cities. So we will hear from some of the partners from those cities. But at the same time, we are going to be guided by these sound bites through the discussions. And the idea is to give you, our audience, sort of a mini taster or an experience of what the learning labs were really all about, and to inspire us into the discussion. After the sound bites, we will then go into a live discussion, and this is going to be convened by 3 seasoned researchers from FRACTAL, and they will share their experience from the learning processes because they were very involved when it came to the designing, the facilitation, the learnings, for example, from these learning labs. But additionally, and as the topic or the summary of this session goes, we are also going to be talking about podcasts. And what we will aim to do is to review how podcasts can be used as a media output, as well as a creative and also interactive platform to share knowledge, to inspire actions, and to form new connections, especially when it comes to action around building sustainability in cities. And this resonates very well with the theme of this conference. So at this point, allow me to introduce our team. And you may have seen some of our profiles from the advertorial for this session. First up is Alice Mcclure. Alice is the FRACTAL coordinator, and she is based at the University of Cape Town. And today she is going to be our session facilitator. Alice is joined by Anna Taylor. Again, Anna is a researcher. She's also based at the University of Cape Town. And together with Sukaina Bhuwani, who is a senior researcher at the Stockholm Environmental Institute in the United Kingdom, they are going to take us through our mini lab. Very, very exciting stuff in store for all of us. And again, like I said, our panelists were very much involved in these learning labs, and we want to really understand what kind of animals these learning labs were. And continuing on with our team, behind the scenes, we have a very formidable team, which comprises of Rebecca Callis. She is head of communications when it comes to anything FRACTAL. We also have with us, again, behind the scenes, Mary Thompson Hall, and she is a senior program specialist who works with me at START International. And yours truly, me, myself, and I. So Mary will be our timekeeper today. So we will hear from her as we proceed. So do not be surprised when she interjects and keeps us in tow when it comes to time. But as the technical team, we will be on the lookout for your questions, for your chat, and all things technical. Are there any urban champions in the house? We encourage you to listen in today, but more so, as I said before, this is an interactive session, so we really want you to participate. It's not about the panelists, but we want to hear from you. And so the way it is designed is that we want to have feedback and reflections. These will be invaluable to us, but also to the urban resilience community at large. And who knows, like I said, we want to know about this animal called podcast. you might just end up featuring on a podcast. So your golden voices will be quite invaluable to us today. Because the session is recorded as we interact, please take note of the following Zoom etiquette. We are all in the same room and we will not be able to mute your mics. So please make sure that if you are not speaking, you mute your mic. This will really help us so that we do not have background noise, and also for the quality of the recording and the session. Again, if you have something to say, please feel free, but please raise your hands. And we will take note of that as we go on in the discussion. But for those introverts like myself who don't really like to talk unless if they have a gun pointed to their heads like I have been, please feel free to use the chat box. We will be on the lookout for your questions. And then for those who are introverts, you can follow up with us after the session. We will provide some of our contact information. Now, like I said, I'm an introvert. I have to hand over to the extroverts. And to start us off, I'll hand over to Anna and Sukaina. They have a lovely surprise for us, which requires our full attention and participation. And after this, we'll then dive into the main session, which Alice will lead. Over to you, Anna and Sukaina.
Thank you so much, Muzume. You're handing over to another introvert, actually. So I hear you. Welcome, everybody. It's really nice to see everybody here in our room. We want to just get a quick feel for who's in our room. So I'm going to request, if you're happy to do so, even though we may have some introverts in the room, if you're happy to switch on your video, would you mind doing that so we can play a little game basically before we get going with the session? And then, that's great. And then once you've done that, if you see in the top right-hand corner of your screen, you should see a button that says View. And if you switch to the gallery view, if you haven't already done so, you should have a nice overview of everybody here. And then the last thing I want to do before I ask you a couple of questions is to take your finger and cover your camera like so that you are completely hidden. We still have some shy people in the room. Okay, great. So now we want to just get a feel of who of you in the room is based in an African city. If you're based in an African city, please uncover your camera. Quite a lot of people, but we do have some international participants as well, it seems. Great. And then if you cover your camera again, can you uncover your camera if you have participated in a learning lab before, if you know what a learning lab is? Okay, great. So a couple of people who haven't, so there should be some interesting learning today. And then lastly, if you cover your camera again, uncover your camera if you regularly listen to podcasts. Oh, wow. Okay. So quite a lot of you. So we have a lot of opportunities to get really good, valuable feedback from you guys. That's exciting. Okay, great. I'm going to hand over to Anna now.
Great. Thanks, Sukaina. So it's nice to see the diversity of people in the room. And because it sounds like some of you are regular podcast listeners, and we are very keen to learn from you as much as we hope we've got a few things to share with you. For the second part of the introduction icebreaker, we'd love for you to use the chat function, the text chat function, to share some of your experience and thoughts with all of us in the room. So I'm going to ask you, like Sukaina did, 3 questions, but instead of covering or uncovering your video, we'd love for you to type a response in the chat so that everybody can see your answers and hopefully learn from each other. So the first question, especially for those who said they are regular podcast listeners, but for anybody who listens to podcasts, could you tell us in the chat function, what is one of your favorite podcast series? It can be anything, fiction, non-fiction, urban, climate related, anything whatsoever, but share with us what one of your favorites is. I see a few coming in. I'm definitely planning to save this list so that I can look them up myself. Brilliant. A few more coming in. There's some inspiring options there. Okay, now thinking about your favorite podcast series, what do you think is a really key ingredient that makes for a great podcast? Please type your answer in the chat. Diversity, inspiring hosts, creativity, rich stories, good storytelling. Brilliant. Quality information. Nice. And then lastly, a slight deviation from the podcast theme, but to zoom out to the kind of the big picture of what this conference is all about. When you hear the term urban change maker, who do you think of? That could be a specific person in which case you can tell us who that is and maybe describe who they are to us, or it can be a type of person. But when you hear urban change maker, what's the first person who pops into your mind? Brilliant. Again, a lovely diversity. Youth, artists, entrepreneurs, government people, development enthusiasts, poets, social entrepreneurs. I think we're getting the sense of the amazing quality of having diverse people and ideas and perspectives in the room with us today. So thank you for all your answers. As I say, I think we're going to all pick up some good tips in there on both what podcasts to listen to, how to make a good podcast, and hopefully who to look for as inspiration for those of us, I think, who probably makes up all of us who are trying to be part of the urban change making community. So thanks for that. And I'm going to now hand over to Alice to introduce us to the idea of learning labs as they were implemented in FRACTAL, and also tell us a bit about the podcasts. Over to you, Alice.
Thanks very much, Anna. Can you see my screen and can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you and we can see your screen, yes.
Perfect. So Anna and Sakena gave us a really nice taster of some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today around podcasts, around transdisciplinary learning labs. And my job is to talk to you a little bit about the case study that bounds our conversation today, which is the Future Resilience of African Cities and Lands project. And then also to host a dialogue between a couple of people who have been involved in FRACTAL and in the learning labs and in the podcast series that we're currently producing. So to give you a bit of a background about FRACTAL, FRACTAL involved many different partners from different disciplines, people working across governance, climate science impacts, modeling, as well as societal stakeholders. So those included government at different levels, NGOs, development aid organizations, to really advance scientific knowledge about climate change and to integrate this into planning or decision making to increase the resilience of Southern African cities. And a key part of FRACTAL was this transdisciplinary co-production approach. And for those of you who are not sure about transdisciplinarity or haven't heard of the term before, it basically means researchers working together with societal stakeholders to try and understand a complex problem and then to consider responses to that complex problem. You can see a huge range of participants who were involved in FRACTAL in this slide. I think an important part of this bigger picture is to remember that the municipalities were the main societal partners with whom the FRACTAL research team were working. So they were really pivotal to the FRACTAL processes. So FRACTAL was implemented in 9 cities with activities to varying degrees and extents, but all of the activities were framed within the overarching objective of city climate resilience, and also acknowledging the connections of these cities to the lands in which they were situated. So in all the cities, the approach was context-led, and so there were a lot of activities to try and understand what the priorities are in the city. What are the decision processes? Who's involved in these decision processes? How will climate change exacerbate ongoing challenges, etc.? And again, across all cities, water emerged as a burning theme to try and explore and understand the risks associated with water now and in the future. I think what's important for this session is that across these different cities, learning labs, which are the topic of today's session, were implemented to the greatest extent in Lusaka and Windhoek and in Maputo. So these were the activities in which there were between 4 and 5 learning labs across the whole of FRACTAL. So this is a fairly messy, busy diagram that we developed near the beginning of FRACTAL to try and show the different aspects of what we were doing in the work. And it's supposed to look messy, and it's supposed to look busy, and it's supposed to look like there's lots going on because it is representative of African cities. But I'm going to pull out a couple of key elements that are important to understand in the context of FRACTAL. So the first is this connection of multiple scales. And so acknowledging that African cities are located within lands and they're connected to these lands in terms of the resources that people are using in the cities, but also the multiple scales of governance. So even though we worked most closely with municipalities, these municipalities are obviously nested within other scales of governance, national scales of governance, international scales of governance, and provincial or regional scales of governance. Climate was also a really important part of FRACTAL. We wanted to understand more about the core climate science, and then to try and distill the important information that is relevant to decision-making processes in cities. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how we did this just now in our conversation. But another really important aspect of FRACTAL, which was quite groundbreaking for a couple of the teams who were working, the climate scientists who were working in FRACTAL, was really exploring this idea of governance. So how do the cities work? Who are the actors at the different scales and levels? As I've mentioned, what are the decision-making processes? And how do the various relations influence urban governance? Also, how was climate considered, and how might it be better considered in processes of thinking about resilient African cities? And this was done, through a process of city learning. And city learning was really about bringing people together, lots of different types of people together, to try and understand the risks in these cities, how these would get worse under conditions of climate change, and then to consider appropriate responses. And there were lots of different types of city learning processes. The one that we are going to focus on today, as we've mentioned a couple of times, is this idea of learning labs. And learning labs are multi-stakeholder learning processes that help to co-explore. And when we say co-explore, we mean bring people together to understand the value of the work that each group does and how that can contribute to decision-making and to co-produce knowledge on climate-sensitive burning issues. But I think there might still be a couple of questions about what a learning lab is and how this is different to another event in a city that aims to co-produce knowledge or to produce knowledge that helps with decision-making. And so I'm going to give you a little bit more information on the learning lab. The learning lab approach was born of this idea, or this acknowledgement, that we don't yet understand how to govern climate change well at the city scale and at other scales. So there's a need for experimentation in terms of climate change governance, in terms of climate change solutions, a need for experimentation in terms of policy development and also governance, as I've mentioned, but also the growing acknowledgement that we as researchers need to collaborate with societal stakeholders, and there needs to be collaboration across scientific disciplines and societal stakeholders, and to embed research in real world contexts. So enter this idea of the learning labs, or labs in the real world, or real world laboratories. There are a couple of different names that relate to the same concept. And it's really about constructive dialogue, constructive conversations, which is a theme that we are going to carry through the session today, to allow for many different important perspectives to come together, as I've mentioned, to understand problems and then to think about solutions. And I think a really nice way to understand learning labs when compared with more conventional workshops is through a couple of principles. And this is a table that is from a working paper that is yet to be published. But when compared with a conventional workshop, the City Learning Lab introduces this idea of a third space. So what is a third space? A third space is a space outside of a home space. My home space would be, for example, the University of Cape Town. A municipality representative's home space would be within the municipality. And there's a dynamic that we have in our home spaces. And when you step into a third space, which is outside of everybody else's home space, you enter as equals into that third space and sort of flatten the hierarchies in a small way. There's also a shared ownership of the process by researchers and also societal stakeholders. These learning labs are always transdisciplinary. As I've mentioned, what transdisciplinary means, bringing societal stakeholders and researchers together. The idea is that all people should be able to contribute equally in these learning labs, no matter their differences in roles, titles, or societal importance. And there are a lot of activities that are explicitly designed to draw out different voices. And Zime mentioned earlier that there are different opportunities for people to engage in this space in different ways. And learning labs are really about allowing different spaces for people to engage in a way that suits them while still being aware of protocols. Also, the idea to always co-produce new knowledge that supports decision-making, and that it's an iterative process. So, for example, in FRACTAL, there were a series of learning labs in the cities, and each learning lab, the design of each learning lab, the content that was covered in each learning lab was dependent on what came out of the learning lab before and what societal stakeholders deemed as important. And so there was this iterative emergent process of learning over time. The learning labs are anchored in a real world context, as we've mentioned, to produce useful and usable knowledge. And another really important aspect of the learning labs is this idea of shared and mutual learning between researchers and also societal stakeholders. So it's not only about a transactional process of researchers handing over their knowledge, it's really about researchers learning from societal stakeholders and vice versa, everybody mutually learning together to maximize individual and collective learning. A lot of activities for experiential and social learning. And when we say experiential learning, we mean experiencing activities firsthand. So in FRACTAL, for example, people were taken to sites of risk, sites of flooding, sites where people are having trouble accessing water, etc., to be able to see these firsthand, to talk to people firsthand about these risks. And social learning relates to collective learning processes, so learning with a group of people. Also, really importantly, the learning labs are supposed to be safe spaces in which dominant approaches or narratives can be challenged and shifted if necessary. And then I've mentioned this before, this idea of really constructive dialogue. So allowing time for people to speak to one another and for no attacks of different groups of people, no finger pointing, even though this is sort of a natural tendency that takes some time to mediate. So to try and land some of these ideas, I am going to show, there's my cue, to show a video of a series. So this is looking back over the whole of FRACTAL, which was implemented from 2015 through to, and still ongoing. We're wrapping up now in 2021. But this is basically shows a series of different activities that were implemented in FRACTAL over this time in the different cities. And it'll hopefully give you a little bit of an insight into some of these activities. And then we're going to discuss them a bit more in a dialogue after I show you this video. Let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, so hopefully that video inspired some questions already about the Learning Lab approach. And now what we're going to do after that short introduction to FRACTAL and the Learning Labs is we're going to enter into a dialogue, which is, as I've mentioned, something that was really important in FRACTAL, this idea of dialogue, enter into a dialogue about the Learning Labs, looking at three aspects. So the process, the climate science, and then the cities in which these Learning Labs were implemented. And what we're going to do is we're going to use sound bites from a podcast that FRACTAL has been producing in collaboration with START. Some of the team members in this session are from START. And we're currently in the process of recording the second season, which focuses on transdisciplinarity using FRACTAL as a case study. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each of these sound bites, and then I'm going to ask my colleagues, Anna and Sukena, who were integrally part of these Learning Labs, a question each. And then after they've answered the questions, then I'm hoping that each of you will have your own questions that you pose, and we can spend some time discussing those questions before moving on to the next soundbite and set of questions. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to the first soundbite. The first soundbite is it's a colleague of ours, Gilbert Siame, who's based at the University of Zambia, and he was really critical in driving the Learning Lab in Lusaka and beyond. And in this soundbite, he's talking about how and why the Learning Lab process worked. This is from the second episode of the second seasons of START, and we've just recorded this, so it's forthcoming. And hopefully it gives you a bit of an appetite to listen to the podcast. So let me play that quickly.
Cities experience very complex challenges that no one single authority can address just by themselves. And so in the era of climate change, it is essential that we find methods and ways to bridge various forms of knowledge and experiences so that we can begin to innovate together in the cities and then begin to find solutions to address those complex challenges. The complex issues are even made worse when we add the climate change layer. And so what the Learning Lab did, particularly if I'm to reflect on Lusaka and then reflect on the wider practices that we did in FRACTAL, is for us to begin to break the barriers of working in silos, working in isolation, which is very typical in many parts of the world and West in a place like Zambia. We needed to have a flexible, dynamic question that cuts across one discipline. If we talk of water, for example, getting water flowing, addressing water insecurity, whether it's too much water or too little water, requires people to work across disciplines. And that question in itself brought people together, brought people from the energy company, Zescott, brought people from Lusaka Water, brought people from local government, it brought people from the communities that are flooded and engulfed in significant climate-related challenges like a borehole drying. So we need a dynamic, flexible question that resonates with the interests, various interests in the city. Then the second part that allowed us to sort of succeed in our work is that you need a very diverse audience. No one is going to solve the water problem alone. We need a diverse audience. So in selecting who comes to lab, we need to know what is this challenge like and who has what experience. And so it's not about water engineers, it's not about climate scientists, it's not about urban planners, it's about harnessing the diverse knowledge in the city to innovate together. The second part is that you need a very carefully thought through and carefully selected venue so that people feel at home, people feel flexible, people feel free to express themselves. And on top of that, we had to deploy a very careful facilitation process. A process that is aware of the internal dynamics amongst these institutions. First of all, they had been working together for a long time. And now they need to work together. And to facilitate that type of a process so that people can truly work together, genuinely so, Genuinely think that somebody in ZESCO, somebody in water company, somebody in energy company, somebody in the community, they have something to offer on the table, and we can harness and we can benefit from that process. To get those processes genuinely facilitated, somebody needs to be aware of the power dynamics in the room. Somebody needs to be aware of the different interests in the room. And somebody needs to be aware of the social relations that shape our human experiences every day. And that is very crucial. The other part, before I conclude, is that you need to succeed, you need to be aware of the competing challenges that these institutions are facing. Some of them have no equipment. Others have no finance to address some of these problems. So even as we innovate, as we are innovating in our labs, we are sort of engaging with what we can call something very pragmatic. What is that we can do now in the medium term and in the longer term? So it's not a space for wish listing. It's a space for innovating together in real practical terms. And it's a space for us to set commitments that make us committed as a diverse group of people and institutions to think and act and address climate change issues. So that is what I see as a typical setup of a lab, and that's how we're able to run through it at city level. And at wider regional level, it takes similar approaches, except we had to think a little bit online, and I'll reflect on that later. Thank you.
So hopefully the audio was clear so that you could hear Gilbert reflecting on what he thought were some successful aspects of learning labs and why it was important to host learning labs in particular ways in Lusaka, primarily for him, but also in the other cities in FRACTAL. And so I'm going to start off by asking Anna a question about the learning labs, because we've heard about sort of some of the key themes across the different learning labs. But a question that I'd probably have if I wasn't involved in a process like this is, how did the different teams in FRACTAL decide what the lab should comprise? How did the teams decide what activities should be included in the labs, and how did they decide what content should be included and how this evolved over time? Yeah, maybe you can comment a bit on this, Anna.
Thanks, Alice. I just want to start by dwelling on your mention of deciding as a team, because I think that is the first key ingredient in designing a learning lab process. So in FRACTAL, we formed teams that had representatives from different members of the partner organizations in FRACTAL for each of the cities where we were going to host learning labs. And those teams were pretty diverse in terms of the organizations, the expertise, the disciplines, the experiences those people brought. And crucially, they were made up of people who work and operate and live within those cities, as well as partners involved in FRACTAL who are outside of those cities. So the team for designing these labs in each city was made up of people who know about, like Gilbert mentioned, have facilitation skills and know about reading power dynamics in a room and what kind of exercises really draw people together, encourage creativity. The team included people who are climate scientists, who know a lot about the technical content of climate knowledge and research. People like members of ICLEI who know a lot about city networks and the dynamics around politicians and mayors and drawing them into conversations. People from NGOs who know about bringing community representatives into these kinds of processes, engineers who know some of the technical things around how cities work from an infrastructure perspective. So basically, the team that were designing these brought a real diversity of perspectives and skills, and were part of deciding what should go into the program. These tended to be the learning labs that we hosted in FRACTAL tended to be multi-day events, so usually 2 or 3 days long with sessions throughout the day, and sometimes in parallel, sometimes in plenary. And so there were lots of elements that made up the lab. And we really tried to, so the second aspect after the importance of having a diversity of people designing it is bringing together a mix of both the content that's going to be covered in the labs to really try and make sure that the topics that are going to be introduced and sort of tackled in each of the sessions, there's something that will hook in different kinds of participants. That's from a content perspective, but then also a diversity of format. So some that are more of the classic kind of information provision sessions where there might be somebody standing at the front giving a PowerPoint presentation, because some people like to, attend events where they know that they're going to get some new information out of it that they are looking for, they didn't have otherwise. But making sure that those were balanced with much more participatory, open, creative kinds of sessions and exercises where it was clear that people were going to be asked to step out of their comfort zones, to add something into the conversation, to maybe go into debate with people who are coming from a different perspective, but in a fun way, not only in a very kind of conceptual, sort of academic, cognitive, debating way, but through, you will have seen in some of the pictures, putting together puzzles, using lots of Post-its, playing games that involve pouring cups of rice into different bowls. So really trying to be creative about the format so that people turned on and off different parts of their brain, came at things from very different perspectives. So we really tried to create a balance throughout each of the labs. And then to finish off, the third aspect of designing the labs, I would say, is the importance of kind of emergence and iteratively designing each lab off the back of what had happened in the previous lab in that city. So to make sure that there was some continuity and what had worked well, and topics that were opened up as being very important fed through into subsequent labs. But then also learning from what had worked well or been a hot topic or session or exercise in the labs of other cities. So we had a lot of cross-pollination when putting together the programs of these labs, learning from a lab from another city that had happened just before the lab we were designing, to make sure that we were really learning as we go, not having like a preconceived notion of what would work and what didn't, testing different things in different cities, and then trying to use the best of what did work and adapting those to the context of another city. And so I'd say those are some of the key ingredients that went into designing these labs.
Thanks, Anna. That's really useful. And I think a key part of thinking about the design and content of these labs is that you continue to learn about how to do this over time. As the FRACTAL team, we knew very little about how to do this from the beginning, and so over time we got a bit better at knowing how to pull content and knowing how to pull people in. And that also was an experiential process. But I'm gonna ask Sakena. Sakena, if I remember correctly, you were involved in learning labs in Lusaka and Windhoek and possibly also Maputo. Can you comment on the differences in the process across these different cities, and also potentially also the similarities if these jump to mind?
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, I was going to say actually the difference is so much, I would say the process of the facilitation, the design of the facilitation was surprisingly similar. So a lot of the things Anna's just mentioned around the team dynamics and understanding what worked, and as Gilbert mentioned, really knowing the different interests and the framing and competing challenges that different actors had. A lot of the facilitation that built on that knowledge was very similar across the cities, but what was different was how the processes and the exercises and the games and all the sort of fun and more serious things that we did played out and what they fed into. So the processes they fed into were obviously different in each city, but each thing, I guess one of the key things about FRACTAL was it was really trying to tap into the different framing that different individuals and stakeholders had about the burning challenges in the city, and trying to bring everyone to this common space. So the third space Alice mentioned, trying to get everyone to step out of their comfort zone into the third space and sort of put their assumptions and judgments aside and come to a sort of common understanding of how to address the city challenges. Water security in the cities was quite a big issue across all of them. And nevertheless, the processes that FRACTAL fed into were different. So in Lusaka, for example, a lot of the conversations revolved around looking at the water energy climate nexus, but opportunities evolved, for example, to work with journalists throughout the project. At one point in the project, there was an opportunity to work with journalists and run some training together with them. And from that process, we started to develop some policy briefs on the burning issues that had been identified in the city. So 4 different policy briefs were developed around water quality and groundwater depletion and flooding and so on. And different experts in the room could contribute to those policy briefs, and they were really co-produced products. And then,
sorry, we have 1 minute before the next soundbite.
Okay, and then that led to you know, all of these kind of things were iterative, and we presented those policy briefs at a high-level breakfast with the mayor and representatives from government and ministers and so on. And so that was very different from Windhoek, where what happened there was a climate change strategy and action plan was already in development in the city, and the FRACTAL processes and conversations and learning labs led to a more integrated and less siloed approach to that strategy and action plan. And it then became renamed the Integrated Strategy and Action Plan. So that was quite a different process in the end, but it was using a lot of the same skills and co-productive processes that were common across the cities.
Thanks, Sakena. And thank you also to Mary for being our strict timekeeper. We are very bad at stopping talking in FRACTAL. So we need a strict timekeeper. So thank you to Mary. I'm hoping that we can move, if we do run out of time for questions with the audience, at the end of each soundbite, there is a bit of time at the end of these soundbites to have a bit of a Q&A. So if you have questions related to the processes that we're discussing, and then the content that we're going to be discussing now, then please keep these in your minds or write them down, then we'll deal with them once we've listened to the sound bites. So that was a discussion about the processes, the learning lab processes, how they were different in cities, how they were the same in cities. And now we're going to focus a little bit more on how we dealt with understanding climate change in the context of the cities. And I'm going to play a soundbite from the first episode of the STARTcast that we've spoken about. You can see a screen grab of it in this slide. And this is a soundbite in which Chris Jack, who's a colleague at UCT and the co-PI of FRACTAL, is discussing an approach called the climate risk narratives. And these climate risk narratives basically involved climate scientists and societal stakeholders thinking about the future of the cities and writing stories, a series of different stories for the future of their cities, and then engaging with those stories to decide on priority actions. And Chris is going to be talking a little bit about how these climate risk narratives came about and why they were important in the learning lab processes. Chris is a physical climate scientist, but has very much been involved in the engagements in Lusaka and elsewhere. This is a little bit of a longer soundbite, but it's a really nice overview of the climate risk narrative process. So enjoy this.
I mean, the idea of climate risk narratives actually emerged again from a moment of frustration. I was involved in South Africa developing the UNFCCC third national communication, which, for those of you familiar, it's a big report that countries commit to producing as part of the UNFCCC process. And don't need to go into those details, but it's basically a big country report on climate change, climate impacts, climate mitigation for a particular country. And we, as a research group, had been involved in it for several iterations. This was the third iteration that we were involved in. And once again, we were sitting around the table with the same people as usual, because it's a small community in South Africa, saying, okay, well, how are we going to do this? We're going to, we're going to look at these models, we're going to produce these maps, we're going to produce these plots, we're going to write little summaries, and it's going to go in a report. And again, I sat there thinking, why are we doing this again? We did it first iteration, second iteration, third iteration. What has really changed? And it's, in some sense you can say, well, the science is advanced, so we need to update the science. But it was just, again, really frustrating. And then what really struck me is in a tea break during one of these meetings, while I was making my coffee, listening to the conversations around me and hearing how people were translating the climate science that had just been presented into narratives. And depending on who was speaking, a different narrative emerged. So someone who was very involved in ecosystems conservation would be very passionate about ecosystem destruction as a consequence of the information we just presented. Someone involved in economics had a very different angle. They were looking at green economy and transitioning economies and so on. So very different narratives coming from the same information that was presented. At the same time, I just had my first child and was reading to her every night. And this idea of stories as a way of explaining complexity. So a lot of children's stories, actually, there's some quite deep, complex concepts underneath them. When you read them 500 times, they start coming out. So so I really started thinking about sort of narrative process. And I proposed to the Third National Communication team that we do all the normal climate science, we present it in a normal way, but why don't we also write sort of narrative stories that describe the future of different parts of South Africa under climate change. And so we discussed this for a while, and one of the first responses was, but it's uncertain. We don't know what the future is going to be. So I said, well, let's write more than one story then. Let's have different stories. So for the Western Cape in South Africa, we can have 3 stories and say, this is one story, this is another story, and this is another possible story. These are plausible. The science supports them. This is what the Western Cape could look like in, say, 2050. And so we tried it, and they were still quite climate sciencey. We still used way too much climate science terminology. And we still wrote in the future tense. We said, this may happen, maybe this will happen. There's a chance that this might happen. But I think it was a really interesting process. Unfortunately, they ended up in an appendix in the Third National Communication. I don't think anyone really knew what to do with them. And that's something we reflected on. Because they weren't co-produced, people didn't own them and people didn't know what to do with them. So they kind of disappeared into the background. But the idea really stuck with me, and we did some more work with the City of Cape Town, and there we tried to do it much more interactively. So we developed some climate narratives for the City of Cape Town, climate change, and we did a workshop with people from the City of Cape Town government, and they provided some feedback, which was quite useful, and we started evolving this idea. So then when FRACTAL came along, we again thought this is a really nice opportunity to test the idea. And so where it really fits in is we can, using climate risk narratives, we can co-produce stories of the future for different contexts. So we can work with decision makers, for example, in Lusaka. We can bring our climate science information. They can bring all their contextual understanding of how does the city work, what really happens, what really impacts different parts of the city, different communities within the city, what impacts the city from outside, so hydroelectricity, agriculture. We can bring these all together and we can weave these stories of what the future might look like. And yes, we need to accommodate uncertainty. So again, we have multiple stories of what the future might look like. But it's really a way that we can sort of co-produce a narrative, because the alternative is that we present the climate science information and every person or every subgroup walks away with their own narrative, and there's no cohesion and there's no learning across different disciplines and across different ways of understanding things. So that's really the idea of the climate risk narratives. And I think they've worked really well. In some cities, it's been more challenging because they do have a particular place that they fit in. So, for example, in Maputo, I think there's been a lot of work around climate risk in Maputo. They've been very exposed to a lot of tropical cyclones and other hazards. And so there's been a lot of existing work around climate change and climate risk. And so I think what they were looking for was a lot more detail. The disaster risk management people in Maputo really want detail around extreme events, magnitudes of events, and they didn't find that in the narratives. So I think they struggled a little bit with it. I think it takes a bit of thinking, a bigger picture thinking. It kind of forces you out of your disciplinary space to try and look at the bigger picture. And I think there's still value in that, but it was a bit of a wrestle in some of the cities. I think there's still some value in it. Lusaka had landed really well. I'm not sure why. I think we can maybe get some other ideas on why. I think the process worked really smoothly there. I think some of the shifts in narrative from the drying up of the Kafui to the risk of hydropower failure really got captured well in the climate risk narratives. And then in Windhoek, I mean, Tammy can probably talk a lot more about the Windhoek experience. They also landed well, but the really nice thing in Windhoek was there was a lot of feedback around the nuances of the language used in the narratives, and also some of the more positive perspectives. So the climate risk narratives tend to be quite bleak. We're all worried about the bad stuff that's going to happen. And there was some feedback in Windhoek to say, but we have plans, we have positive policy that we have in place to avert this. So can we build that into the narratives as well? And so what we're really seeing with the narratives is that they became a really powerful, I'm going to use another term from a different discipline, but a boundary agent, a mechanism for wrestling with our thinking about the future and bringing different perspectives on the future together. So as much as initially they were kind of a way of capturing climate science information and almost communicating it clearly, what they've really become is this mechanism to wrestle with our thinking and to bring lots of perspectives together into one entity, if you like, that we can wrestle with. So less of a product and much more of a process.
Okay, apologies again for the long soundbite, but hopefully you found it as interesting as I did. And in true fractal style of emergence, I was going to pose a question to Anna and Sakena about their experiences of the climate risk narratives, but I think I'm going to open up to the audience because we have heard quite a bit from the fractal team and people who've been involved in the fractal experience. And so I wanted to open up and see if people who are listening have any questions about either the process or the climate risk narratives. And then I'll prompt my colleagues to perhaps respond to these questions. I see we have one already from Kath. And Kath asks, what steps are necessary to build the diverse, sustainable, resilient, welcoming networks necessary to successfully run learning labs like these? And how do we productively move out of our comfort zones? While others are thinking about a question that they might have related to the processes or the climate risk narratives, I wonder if Anna or Sakena would like to respond to this question.
I'm happy to take a first quick stab, although Alice, I suspect you probably have a lot to say on this question, being the key person trying to hold all of the bits together in Fractal. But one thing I would say in response to Catherine's question is building trust, building familiarity and building trust. And that takes time for people to meet, feel each other out, have a few engagements, slowly allow enough conversation to emerge that people get a better sense of what each other, does in their work, what kind of person they are, how best to reach out to them, where they might see a sort of some way that they can be useful to each other. So I think that, as with all sort of human relationships, it just takes time to get to know each other and to build a sense of sort of reciprocity and trust that the person is, that you're kind of working towards similar things, or that you're there to help each other, not kind of make each other's life more difficult or make fun of each other or make each other feel stupid. And so we designed a lot into the labs to try and facilitate that. So lots of icebreakers to draw people out of themselves and meet other people in a sort of fun, less formal way than often happens, particularly in either academic or sort of government-led processes that tend to be quite formal. So we tried to make it fun. We tried to build in quite a bit of social activities. So a number of the labs were kind of semi-residential. People would stay where the lab was because we tried to take them kind of out of people's familiar spaces. And so often in the evenings, we would have, drinks or dinner together, or some kind of, I think in one of the clips, somebody mentioned about field trips, take people to sites where things were happening, either climate impacts or risks were very evident, or projects were happening to try and reduce some of those climate risks. And by, traveling on the bus together, about standing around looking at a borehole or a wastewater treatment plant or something like that together, it takes people out of their formal office environments, and you end up kind of making connections that are more lasting and based on trust and familiarity. And I think that's very much how these things emerge and are sustained.
Thanks very much, Anna. And I'm going to build very quickly on this point of trust that you've made. You've already mentioned one of the points that I wanted to speak about, which was social engagements. But I think related to this idea of trust, two key words that have come out of FRACTAL, or that sort of have become important in FRACTAL, are those of empathy. And so really, really, really trying hard to understand other people, understand their challenges, understand their working environments, understand what motivates them. And so this idea of empathy for people with whom you are entering into these learning lab processes, but also humility. And this is, I think, something that, empathy seems kind of obvious if we're trying to understand one another, but humility is something that was maybe a little bit more surprising. But the humility of the climate scientists, for example, to enter into a room and say, okay, or to think and to behave in a way that indicates that they don't think that they're the ones who have all the answers, and that they actually, their knowledge is just as valuable as everybody else's in the room. I think that the humility and empathy were really important in building these networks. There are two other questions in the chat, and I see Mzime has a hand up. I was just wondering, Mary, how are we for time in this soundbite?
About 1 minute and 40 seconds.
Okay, I'm going to keep those. Thank you. I'm going to keep those questions in the chat, and I'm going to ask Mzime if she can just present hers, and I'll take a note, or maybe she wants to add to what's already been said.
Thanks so much, Alice. As Anna was talking, and also maybe just to react to the two questions about what happens afterwards and what FRACTAL would have done differently if it was online. I think one of the important things to note is that FRACTAL was or is a long-term project. So it's been running since 2015. And that has kind of given time in terms of these processes and building relationships and so forth. So, it's fortunate in that way, because all these things take time. And then to quickly talk about what happens next, building the relationship, building trust and network meant that, other projects and other work, and also the legacy of FRACTAL in terms of engagement, could continue in those cities post-FRACTAL and also post the learning labs or the FRACTAL events. And then just to throw in quickly that FRACTAL has also convened learning labs and meetings online during the pandemic. And it's been a very interesting process of learning as well. But I think the others will talk about this a little bit more. And it has led us to such processes as the podcast. So all these things in terms of learning and being iterative have been very helpful to take us to where we are today. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mzime, for providing a perspective on the virtual engagements. Yeah, we were forced as a team to move these activities that were so founded on face-to-face engagements and relationships into a virtual space. And something that we've reflected on as a team is the importance of having built those relationships face-to-face before moving into the virtual space. And so I think that really allowed us to continue the productive aspects, but also to acknowledge some of the really beneficial aspects of moving onto the online space. So for example, participants from Blantyre, Gaborone and Harare could attend the Lusaka Learning Lab in the virtual space for an hour or two because it just required an internet connection and data. And so if those were made available through FRACTAL, then participants could join for a session or two, whereas initially they would have had to travel to that city to take part in that learning lab. So there were some pros, but as you can guess, a lot of challenges associated with moving the learning lab into the virtual space. I think creative, inspiring processes similar to what the RISE Festival is trying to do, or is doing really well with this particular event. It helps as well, trying to bring in as much dialogue as possible. And for example, the poetry at the beginning of this session was really inspiring and exciting. Okay, I'm going to play our last soundbite, and this particular soundbite is from Wilma and Cheeto. So Wilma is also at the University of Zambia with Gilbert Siame, and she was a core part of the FRACTAL team. So this soundbite is much shorter than the other soundbites. It's a couple of seconds long, but it provides some insight into why cities are important loci of moving the climate change agenda forward. But another thing that's unique about this particular soundbite is that it's not from the podcast series that we have spoken about so far in the session. It's about another podcast series which is being created by Future Climate for Africa, or FCFA, and that is the bigger consortium within which FRACTAL sits, and it's also a really great podcast. So we'll share those resources so that you can listen to that podcast if you're interested. So let me pull up Wilma.
Cities have the potential to be the frontrunners in providing innovative solutions to climate change. But how do we get cities to plan a proactive strategy against climate change? We've invited Dr. Wilma Nchito, a co-principal investigator on the FRACTAL project and a lecturer in the geography department at the University of Zambia, to weigh in on this subject. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Let's jump right in. Wilma, the FRACTAL project specifically looked at how we can get cities to consider climate information when making decisions. I wonder if we could start by asking you what your thoughts are on cities being well placed to lead in delivering the solutions to climate change.
For us in Lusaka City, I think we felt that cities are best placed because cities are centers of decision making, whether it's central government or the private sector or NGOs. They usually have their headquarters, they usually have their experts based in cities. So when it comes to finding the solutions, these people are the best suited to come together and come up with the solutions for climate change. Cities also have a wide range of actors and the high densities. And you find that they will invariably have a large number of innovative ideas which can be gleaned from these people who live in the cities. And if you find a solution, a city will provide a large number of people who can be impacted by that solution. So for us, these are some of the reasons we felt that cities are best placed to produce the knowledge and also to test the knowledge once it had been produced in the context of climate change.
Okay, so I'm going to ask my colleagues to reflect on their experiences from this soundbite. And again, please feel free to post some questions and we can have a bit more of an input and a conversation, hopefully after our colleagues have provided their inputs. But I wondered, Anna, if I can start with you again. So Wilma alludes to the fact that different people are important for dealing with climate change. And so this includes different levels of government that we've spoken about already in the session. So can you comment on the differences in perspectives that people from different levels of government offered in the labs, how these helped an understanding of the problems and thinking about solutions?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. I think it is interesting to think back on the different perspectives different government representatives brought into the labs in each of the cities. I think they complement each other well, but they operate in their silos. So part of the challenge of the labs was really trying to find meaning across what those different levels of government brought to the table, so to speak. So I think it's fair to say representatives of national government tend to think pretty sectorally, pretty big picture. Obviously, they're thinking countrywide, and they tend to be thinking about the kind of big economic and kind of trunk infrastructure decisions and trade-offs, and what climate change means at that sort of macro level. So they very much bring that perspective into the conversations. Then we had some representatives from more kind of provincial or district subnational governments. And what they really tuned into is the kind of urban-rural linkages. So very much thinking about how things like water, electricity, food flow between urban and rural areas, and what the implications of climate are for that in a sort of, cross-boundary between sort of sub-regions in the country, but at a scale slightly bigger than the city itself, which is really important when thinking about flows of resources and where climate poses a risk to those. And then local government, which was probably most represented in the learning lab, so people from city scale government, they for the most part are very much tuned into neighborhood, community, kind of the grounded realities of how water scarcity, poor water quality, health threats like malaria or cholera outbreaks, how those kind of things really impact households, individuals, communities within the cities. And although city governments are themselves also quite siloed into their different departments and line functions, they do tend to have a slightly more integrated perspective because they're so kind of close to the ground, close to where the issues really play out, than some of their colleagues in provincial or national government. But bringing those different perspectives together in the learning labs is where real value can be added, because the reality is that all of those government representatives across all of the scales, they have different budgets that they work with, they have different mandates to fulfill, they have different partnerships to tap into. But they do all work within, quite complex legislative frameworks, and they face different pools in terms of the politics that they operating within. So they kind of understand each other well from that perspective, even though they see the issues playing out at very different scales. And I think it's also important just to note that that dynamic between the different levels of government takes on a slightly different flavor in each of the cities. So where we held the labs in each cities, it's interesting how, for example, in Lusaka, that we've heard quite a bit about, they have some newish legislation, national legislation, that really promotes kind of participatory, bottom-up, community-based spatial planning. And so there was a very different flavor in terms of really trying to bring community representatives into the planning process and take a more bottom-up approach. Whereas other places, maybe Harare being a good example, there's still quite a top-down, centralized, national government holds a lot of the power. And so the conversation has a slightly different flavor. But the labs are important spaces for bringing those different perspectives together and trying to cut through the different silos and different sort of scales of the problems and the possible solutions to innovate.
Thanks, Anna. And thanks for mentioning Harare, because I think there's been quite a big change in terms of how government, different types of government work together, or different sort of sectors of government work together to deal with climate change. So I'm going to ask Mzime to hold that thought, because She worked a lot in the Harare case study in FRACTAL, and she might be able to comment on it just now. But before we go there, I was wondering if, Sukena, if you can tell us a bit about the kind of approaches or methods that were implemented in FRACTAL to try and understand the governance processes in the cities.
Sure. I think one of the things Anna just mentioned has obviously been really key throughout the cities in terms of looking at the different scales of decision making and trying to understand the different actors and levels of decision making across from the city to the national level. And one of the things in FRACTAL, one of the vehicles in FRACTAL that's been critical, which I probably haven't talked about too much so far, is the role of the embedded researcher. And the reason why they were important in helping us understand the sort of decision-making landscape is because they had the role of sitting between the local academic institution and the city department itself. And so could really spend a long time, the duration of FRACTAL, trying to understand the dynamics of decision-making between all of these different levels and sectors. And that also helped us make sure, we were as inclusive as possible in bringing participants to the labs that represented the widest sort of diversity of views and opinions. In terms of understanding the governance aspects, that was important from a sort of external level, so understanding the national to local and city regional level decision making. It was also actually really important within the city itself to understand how the institution itself was working and to what degree there was siloed thinking or siloed planning going on. In Windhoek, for example, where I spent a little bit of time, one of the approaches we used was to try and look at how decision-making differed at the level of the technical planners and the people really implementing change and policy on the ground, and the sort of barriers and challenges they were facing. And that sort of culminated in some of these sort of, innovative gaming approaches, we actually ended up playing Jenga to, if all of you know what Jenga is, but, trying to build these towers to enable us to have sensitive conversation, use building blocks to build towers and sort of break apart these towers without making them fall down, to try and understand sort of and explore sensitive issues that maybe were difficult to talk about in a workshop context around, the bloating of an organization where there's too much redundancy or a lack of skill or a lack of resources, or actually just not a strong foundation within the organization of knowledge and expertise or finances or whatever it may be. And what we found is doing sort of really interesting creative exercises like that with the technical planners led to a sort of a demand for a better understanding from senior level decision makers about the challenges they were facing on the ground, for their own line managers and senior managers to really understand what the challenges were and why they were operating in silos, or why there was not as much coordination and coherence as there could have been between the different divisions in the city. And then that led us through our urban champions who helped facilitate a lot of these meetings and connections, have a very similar meeting with the senior level decision makers to explore some of the same issues. And then actually we realized in a really nice complementary way that the senior decision makers actually did want to know what was happening on the ground, and they did want to know what the challenges were that were being faced, but they kind of came to a recognition that that was what was missing for them through this learning lab exercise, and a different approach was used there. But the commonality, I think, between all of these exercises and approaches and labs and things that we did was to really sort of surface and unpack what the different framings of the different actors were and what their different values, priorities, basically the values and priorities and different agendas were because of their own mandates, and coming to a shared understanding of what those priorities were really helped people, I think, come to a common understanding of how to address these different issues. I'll stop there because I think we want time for more discussion.
Thanks, Sukena. So a little bit of an insight into some of the activities that were implemented and the research to understand how decision making happened in cities. So before I hand over if Mzime will kindly let me hand over to ask for reflection on Harari. I wondered if anyone else from the floor has a question or a comment on the different processes that you've been hearing about, the different activities that were implemented in the learning labs, the podcast itself. I see our colleague Ademola has raised a point. Ademola, would you like to ask a question at this point? If you would, you feel free to type it into the chat. So Mary has asked a question about how important games were in the learning labs. Yeah, games were included in several of the learning labs, and Sekena has referred to some of the games that help to understand some complex concepts and represented in sort of a more simple way. And also to understand the perspectives of other people, to wear other people's shoes, so to speak. So there were some games that included role plays, and people were asked to adopt the stance of a politician and add a comment or make a decision based on that stance. And they found that they were making very different decisions compared with the decisions they would make in their natural stance. And so games were really important. But the other aspect about games was that they also provided a lot of humor, which were and a lot of laughter in a lot of the labs, that really sort of created the friendly atmosphere and the camaraderie in FRACTAL, and to create that sense of togetherness. And so towards the end, people were referring to the FRACTAL family because that sort of togetherness had been created. And I think the games had a lot to do with that, but also, as I mentioned, representing some of the complex concepts and helping people to understand one another. I wonder if anyone else on the team has a comment about the games.
And on that note too, we have about 1 minute.
Okay. So maybe I can then hand over to Mzime. Mzime, if you'd like to reflect very quickly on Harari, and then to take us into and the kind of the processes that help people to work together, and then to take us into our final few closing minutes. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Alice, for that excellent facilitation. And I will just say a few words about the learning labs and processes in Harare, where I am based. There were not as many learning labs in the city, but there were opportunities for dialogue through workshops and other means. But it was a very long journey that the team, the FRACTAL team in Harare, walked, because initially there was a lot of attitude against researchers, especially coming from the universities, because of the bad experiences that a lot of the partners and city stakeholders had with research being very extractive. So it took a lot of engagement, a lot of meetings, a lot of up and downs, embedded researchers in the cities to really begin to engage and have particularly the stakeholders from the city participate and engage fully in the FRACTAL dialogues and the meetings. But what I would like to just point out is that we traveled from that point to a point where now the Harare City Council has actually created a climate change desk and an environmental management unit. And they have reflected that this is as a direct result of the FRACTAL projects and engagements. And they have also incorporated a lot of their, not a lot, but some of their budget from 2021 onwards to be directed towards a lot of the burning issues that were discussed in the FRACTAL cities. So this is to also address one of my colleagues' questions, who asked me how some of the mayors and people in the cities used some of the information coming out of FRACTAL. So at this point, I really would like to thank Alice, Anna, Sekena, and the whole team for excellent facilitation Alice, do you mind? Okay, can you see my screen now? Thank you. All right. I'd like to thank the team for excellent facilitation. And just to highlight that, we've been talking about podcast, STARTcast, and so forth. And I'm really glad that we had a soundbite from Chris that talked about, climate narratives. And this comes out very well in the first episode of our second series of the STARTcast, where it's all about we have this conversation with the climate scientists from FRACTAL, and they talk about the climate information distillation process. And then the second episode, which is upcoming, also concentrates on learning labs. So if you'd like to know more, please go to our website, the START website, and you can just type in www.start.org and you'll find the STARTcast there. And then the next couple of episodes touch on some of the topics that we've been talking about: embedded researchers, city exchanges, and so forth. So this is to highlight that. And we've been doing a lot of listening today. And this was quite key in FRACTAL, particularly in the learning labs, and it involved active listening. So we hope that it has garnered some interests around learning labs, around FRACTAL, around podcasts, and would really love to hear from you. You can contact us through our organizations, and also after listening to the podcast, or if you'd like to be part of the podcast, we would love that. And just to also point out again, as was said in the start, that this session was recorded, and the conference organizers will be posting the recording on YouTube as well as on the conference website and other social media outlets. And then if you feel you would really like to hang out with us, ask more questions, have more discussions, and so forth, this Zoom room will be open for up to an hour after we officially end, which is in a minute or so. And then also just to point out to you that as you leave, please fill out the conference survey form, which will be provided by the conference organizers. And again, I would like to thank everyone for listening in, staying with us. I promise that the podcast is even better, more fun. We just had snippets, those sound bites, but we are even more fun on the podcast. So I'd encourage a lot of you to listen in and also to give us your reflections, because we really love to hear from you and to learn as we go. So thank you. This marks the official end of our session, and we will be in touch with you, and hopefully you will also reach out to us. Thank you, everyone.